I love The Mummy, one of the best films of 1999. Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz, Arnold Vosloo, Oded Fehr. Man, what a time. And it's turning 25 years old this year. Sorry if that hit you like a chariot claiming your soul for the afterlife, but hey, them's the breaks. And even if you have seen The Mummy like a dozen times or more, and you should do so again, it being a really big birthday year and all, there are a couple of noteworthy things that'll make you appreciate the film even more than ever. So, I'm Ewan, this is What Culture, and here are 20 things you somehow missed in The Mummy. Number 20. The opening shot has surprisingly little CGI. The Mummy revolutionized CGI, since it was one of the earliest mainstream films to utilize certain digital effects, including motion capture, digital cutouts, procedural animation, and computer-generated prosthetics. Even though multiple visual companies worked on The Mummy, the director, Stephen Sommers, made sure digital effects were only used when absolutely necessary. Although the opening shot of ancient Egypt implements CGI, there's not as much in it as you might think. In fact, almost every structure in this sequence is actually a miniature. Contrary to how they look, the temples, pillars, pyramids, Anubis statues, the palace, and the Sphinx were sculpted and painted by members of Industrial Light and Magic. Kim Smith and her team studied archaeological sites and pictures of ancient Egyptian monuments to make the miniatures as authentic as possible. Sadly, the sequence was drenched in artificial lighting, giving the structures an almost unnatural look. For this reason, many viewers may not realize how much physical labor was actually put into the opening sequence, since they have a glossy, computerized sheen in shot. One thing I will say though, having been lucky enough to catch a 35mm rep screening of The Mummy the other year, that glossiness doesn't really shine through when you watch it in that format. Sometimes films are better off without the HD treatment, and I kind of feel The Mummy is one of those. Number 19. That fear in Arnold Vosloo's eyes is real. It's hard not to discuss The Mummy without mentioning the big bad himself, Imhotep, played by Arnold Vosloo, who, I must also add, is equally brilliant in objectively the greatest movie of all time, 1993's Hard Target, but I digress. After betraying the pharaoh, the sinister high priest was buried alive while being eaten by flesh-eating scarabs. Unfortunately, the ritual allowed Imhotep to be reborn as a god if he was resurrected, which he totally was. Although Vosloo never utters a word in English in the movie, Vosloo's performance as Imhotep is frankly incredible. Thanks to his effortless charisma, the underrated actor absolutely steals the show, and he's one of the film's biggest highlights. However, Vosloo required zero acting while performing the burial scene. After all, being wrapped in tight bandages from head to toe for 4 hours would be a nightmare for anyone. While being interviewed by Movie Star, Vosloo said the experience, quote, "may be the worst thing I do in the movie. It was just awful. They wrapped me in tight bandages and put me in a coffin. The shot took 20 seconds to do, but it was a weird feeling." As such, the horror you see in Vosloo's eyes while the bandages are wrapped around his face is 100% genuine. Number 18. What chains? Desperate to locate the hidden land of Hamunaptra, Evelyn heads to a prison with her brother Jonathan after learning one of the inmates, Rick O'Connell, has been there before. After a bit of banter and a punch to Jonathan's face, Evelyn prepares to free Rick so he can help her find the city of the dead. It's a memorable scene since it's the first time the 3 heroes get to interact with each other. But another reason why this encounter stands out is because of one tiny mistake. Throughout the scene, Rick has his hands bound in chains. When Rick utters the line, "Do it, lady," at the end, the chains mysteriously vanish. Although the chains, or lack thereof, can't be seen when Rick whips his arms around his back, it's clear he isn't shackled while being escorted away. Number 17. A mistake that's not really a mistake. So, you might be thinking, hey, Imhotep, how could you possibly confuse Rachel Weisz for your ancient Egyptian love? They're not exactly Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito in Twins, like, there's clear differences between them. However, if you've ever had this thought, just know that the movie was 2 steps ahead of you. To regenerate his body, Imhotep took the eyes of Bernard Burns, who was essentially blind without his spectacles. According to the director's commentary, Imhotep was bestowed with Bernard's poor eyesight, which is why the reanimated corpse mistook Evelyn for his lover. This also explains why Imhotep squints when he first encounters Evelyn, since he has trouble seeing her face. Not a detail you need for this aspect of the film to make sense, but a pretty cool one all the same. Number 16. There are some minor historical inaccuracies. Okay, so it goes without saying that The Mummy takes some major liberties with Egyptian history. The movie depicts Imhotep as an evil priest who specializes in dark magic. In real life, Imhotep was said to have been an architect for the pyramids who probably didn't resurrect himself as an immortal god. I don't know though, who can really say for certain? Of course, drastic changes like this shouldn't be a problem, as The Mummy is a blockbuster and not a documentary. However, the story does get some basic facts regarding Egyptian mythology and culture wrong. Instead of reading the hieroglyphics from right to left, they read them from left to right, for instance, and that's a pretty easy mistake to make. Also, Dr. Terence Bay, played by Eric Avari, mentions that Imhotep is afraid of cats since they're the guardians of the underworld. Being a historian, Bay should probably know the underworld is protected by Osiris, who was the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and the dead. There is a cat god called Bastet in Egyptian lore, but she represents pregnancy and childbirth. And while cats were incorporated into the imagery of the afterlife, they aren't there to keep folks locked up or keep people out. Number 15. References to the original Mummy movie. Being a remake, it's no surprise that The Mummy has one or two nods to the original film. Certain shots of Imhotep's burial scene are practically identical to the immortal Boris Karloff version that we all know and love. Rick's comment about how Imhotep was buried alive because he, quote, got too frisky, is almost directly lifted from the 1932 classic too. However, it's surprisingly easy to miss the biggest callback. Throughout Rick's adventure, he's assisted by Ardeth Bey, played by Oded Fehr, whose people, the Magi, were tasked with preventing the resurrection of Imhotep. Even though Ardeth is a beloved character, many fans may not realize the significance of his name. In the original Mummy, Imhotep passed himself off as a regular historian while prepping his lover's resurrection. In this guise, Imhotep goes by the moniker of Ardeth Bey. Number 14. Anck-su-namun dies the same way twice. After Imhotep's affair with Anck-su-namun was exposed, the pharaoh's concubine stabbed herself to death, knowing her lover could bring her back. Unfortunately, Anck-su-namun had to wait 3,000 years before making her return, which is kind of a while. What's worse is she didn't have any time to enjoy her rebirth. Mere minutes after her resurrection, Jonathan tricked Imhotep's mummified soldiers to slaughter her in, like, a really brutal moment, banishing her to the underworld once more. Interestingly, the way Anck-su-namun dies for the second time mirrors the way she took her own life in the prologue. Both times, she's impaled with a sharp weapon through the stomach. On top of that, neither death is shown on screen. Instead, the camera cuts to the wall behind Anck-su-namun, depicting her shadow doubling over after being stabbed with lots of pointy implements. Since both sequences occur almost 2 hours apart, you may not notice the cause of Anck-su-namun's death, and its presentation is virtually identical. Number 13. The camel wasn't acting. Well, if it isn't my little buddy Benny. Kevin J. O'Connor's character is the kind of guy everyone loves to hate. The cowardly thief doesn't have a redeemable bone in his body, since he betrays Rick, joins forces with Imhotep just to save his own skin, and helps a diabolical mummy kidnap Evelyn. Since Benny is supposed to be a despicable weasel, there's no doubt J. O'Connor nailed the role. I mean, come on, that bit where he's all like, looks to me like we have all the horses, and then Rick's just like, hey Benny, looks to me like you're on the wrong side of the river. Just impeccable cinema. However, he might have been too convincing in the role. After Benny steals gold from the treasure room, he tries to place his riches on a camel. The camel is having none of it though, refusing to move the way Benny orders him to. Although it looks like the camel was probably trained to act this way, that's not actually the case. In reality, the camel behaved in this manner because it genuinely hated Kevin J. O'Connor. Yeah, he was that good in the role, he even invoked the wrath of the wildlife. In fact, pretty much all the humped creatures detested the actor for some inexplicable reason. Although this moment is funny, it's even better after realizing the camel wasn't putting on an act at all. Number 12. Rachel Weisz didn't perform Evelyn's most iconic shot. The Mummy was a career-defining movie for Rachel Weisz. Our leading lady received a ton of praise thanks to her impeccable comedic talents and her phenomenal chemistry with her co-star Brendan Fraser. Evelyn made a huge impression in just her very first scene. Here, we find her working at a library, trying to place a book on a high shelf while atop a ladder. As she stretches out, the ladder becomes momentarily vertical before knocking into the shelf. This creates a domino effect that causes nearly every bookshelf in the room to collapse. The fact this stunt was done without digital trickery in one take is genuinely astounding. However, Weiss didn't perform the stunt herself, as it proved to be far too dangerous, and hey, that's what our committed and extremely talented and underappreciated stunt performers are actually for. Looking closely, viewers will see the shots of Evelyn balancing on the vertical ladder were performed by a stunt double, who, it must be said, deserves their flowers for pulling off such a Buster Keaton-esque feat on camera. Number 11. Put the lights out, Benny. After Imhotep is defeated, Benny accidentally triggers a booby trap, causing Hamunaptra to slowly collapse into the sand. Rick and his comrades escape in the nick of time, while Benny is left sealed in the treasure room, alone to his absolutely befitting fate. Just when things look like they couldn't get any worse for Benny, a swarm of scarabs burst in and surround him from every direction. As the flame in his torch goes out, Benny screams in agony while being devoured alive. Not only was this a suitable end for the treacherous Benny, it was a nice touch to show the torch's flame fading away, symbolizing how Benny's own light is about to be extinguished. Interestingly, no CGI was utilized to manipulate the flame in this shot. Instead, O'Connor used a dimmer switch to adjust the strength of the fire. When he places his other hand on the torch, the flame immediately weakens, indicating that he's pressing the button. It's a simple trick, but it made Benny's death more horrifying and satisfying at the same time. Number 10. That husk looks familiar. After Imhotep is revived, his first task is to slaughter the people who opened his tomb and absorb their organs in order to be fully regenerated. Thanks to the PG-13 rating, these still gruesome death sequences mostly occur off-screen. However, the audience does get a good look at the first casualty of Imhotep, the poor unfortunate Bernard Burns. When Rick hears Bernard's agonizing screams, he rushes over to save him. By the time that Rick reaches him though, the wicked mummy has turned Bernard into a dried up corpse. If this desiccated body was on screen for more than a second, die-hard horror fans may have noticed it has an uncanny resemblance to the husks from the sci-fi horror movie Life Force. And funnily enough, this similarity isn't a coincidence since this is the very same plastic dummy used in that movie. Using the prop as well is pretty fitting, since Imhotep literally sucks the life force out of his victims to enhance his power. Number 9. A very handy animatronic. As Evelyn is about to be sacrificed, Rick appears in the nick of time just to save her, facing off against an army of mummies. What makes this battle remarkable is the mixture of CG and practical effects. We get some very real, very dusty mummies for Rick to fight, as well as the more CG warriors Jonathan accidentally summons. However, there's one specific shot where a mummy isn't digital, or at least part of it isn't. While two mummies pin Rick down, another of Imhotep's mindless minions prepares to crush him with a stone slab. Although Rick tries to grab his sword, it's just out of reach. After a dismembered hand crawls over the blade's handle, Rick uses it to slice the legs of the approaching mummy. Since the hand is moving like it has a mind of its own, it could be easy to misconstrue it as a digital effect. Although this is the case when Rick grabs the decomposing appendage, the first shots are of an elaborate animatronic, and it looks really good. Considering how much work goes into constructing a mechatronic puppet, it's incredible the SFX crew put this together for a shot that only lasts a few seconds. Gotta love animatronics, they're so cool. Number 8. Muzzle Flash was entirely computer generated. No matter how prepared a production team is, there are some issues that nobody is going to be ready for. Sometimes these problems are only obvious in hindsight, which was the case with The Mummy. Even though Stephen Sommers was working with the best of the best, production hit a major snag almost immediately. Since The Mummy is a blockbuster, many action sequences involve heavy gunfire. Where does the story take place? In an arid desert. What happens when sand gets inside guns? Well, they can often jam. This was a serious issue since The Mummy wouldn't be much of an action flick without a few shootouts. To get around this, the tech wizards at ILM had to insert CGI muzzle flashes in many shots where guns are fired, at least for those set in the desert. Number 7. Hidden earplugs. Although sand caused the guns on set to jam, this wasn't a problem while shooting scenes outside the desert. So, while filming the gunfight on the boat, the cast weapons actually still fired blanks. Unfortunately, this led to another issue. Even though blanks aren't real bullets, they're still very, very loud. Not wanting to suffer from tinnitus, some actors were equipped with earplugs during the boat sequence. Of course, special measures were taken to ensure the plugs were obscured from view. However, there is one moment where they are visible. Just as the shootout on the boat is wrapping up, there's a shot of the Americans blasting at the Magi. The shot only lasts 2 seconds, but it's clear as day the two shooters in the middle are wearing plugs. Number 6. Jonathan pulls his gun out twice. As the last 2 entries proved, Stephen Sommers and his team had a knack for fixing problems on set. However, there was always bound to be a few slip-ups considering how vast the production actually was. Although minor flubs are forgivable, there's one continuity problem which actually does stand out a fair bit. After Rick, Jonathan, and the others meet Ardeth Bay, there is a blatant continuity error. Not that it matters, but it's there all the same. After seeing the Magi leader once again, Rick, Jonathan, and the Americans whip out their pistols, oblivious that Ardeth Bay intends to actually help them. When the camera switches to another angle, there's a slight delay of John's hand coming into shot as he draws his weapon a second time. As minor as this gripe seems, it's impossible to unsee once spotted. Number 5. Where did that cat come from? After Rick encounters Imhotep at the hotel, he's surprised when the reborn immortal flees in terror after seeing a cat. As a result, Rick has a cat primed and ready to go the next time Imhotep rears his ugly head, compelling the High Priest to again run away in terror. However, and again, this really does not matter in the grand scheme of things, when Rick enters the room to confront Imhotep again, his hands are empty. In the next shot, he suddenly is holding a cat. After the tabby defiantly hisses at Imhotep, it disappears in the next shot. Due to the kitty's vanishing act, it seems like Imhotep isn't the only one with magical powers. Number 4. Where's all the blood? Though The Mummy was intended to be an outright horror like the original, Stephen Sommers revised it heavily, believing it would work better as a popcorn action flick, and oh how right he was. Of course, that doesn't mean the remake isn't filled to the brim with violence. In fact, some sequences are flat out brutal. The movie depicts tongues being sliced off, eyeballs being plucked out, scarabs burrowing into Omid Jalili, bodies being stripped to the bone, and people being burned alive. On top of that, many scenes involve a fleshless mummy shambling around, which is, needless to say, pretty gross. Genuinely life-altering imagery for me when I saw this as a kid. It's just the best stuff ever. Even with all that in mind though, The Mummy has next to no visible gore. Blood is nowhere to be seen anytime someone is shot or stabbed. Several kills, including both Vanax and Amun's death sequences, are depicted in shadow. The majority of Imhotep's victims meet the end of screen too. And yet, the minimal bloodshed didn't stop The Mummy from being just a brilliantly scary time. The scarabs are nightmare-inducing, despite the fact they're never seen drawing blood. Even though horror productions often focus on over-the-top violence, The Mummy proves that a movie can be genuinely unsettling and gruesome and entertaining without relying on excessive gore. Number 3. John Hannah's wrist. Just before our hero has his big showdown with Imhotep, Jonathan, played by the always brilliant John Hannah, stumbles upon a scarab, mistaking it for a jewel. The nasty beastie suddenly burrows into his hand and begins making its way to Jonathan's skull. Just before it reaches its destination, Rick pulls the bug out before blasting it dead. Though Jonathan is safe, he's left with a big old cut on his palm, forcing him to wear a covering around his hand for the rest of the movie. Or so it seems. In reality, John Hannah sprained his wrist during filming, forcing him to wear a brace until it healed. To avoid this apparatus from being seen, it was hidden with a black cloth in the last few sequences. Since said sequences occur immediately after Jonathan has his hand sliced open, nothing seems out of the ordinary when the character suddenly has a covering around his wrist, but that was the real reason why it was introduced in the first place. Number 2. Jonathan and Ardeth pull a switcheroo. Not everything from the original Mummy script made it into the finished product. Certain scenes proved to be unnecessary or unevenly paced, which led to them being shortened or cut entirely. Not wanting to screw up continuity, those scenes were cut in a way so that nothing actually seems amiss. But certain mistakes still managed to slip through. While making their way through the treasure room, Rick, Jonathan, and Ardeth find themselves surrounded by Imhotep's revived minions. Although this battle was supposed to be much longer, Stephen Sommers thought it was better to truncate the action. However, it's pretty noticeable that a few shots are missing. When the priests emerge from the ground, Jonathan is on Rick's left while Ardeth is on his right. In the very next shot, have swapped places. Even though the editors did their best to tighten up the sequence and maintain continuity as best they couldn't figure out how to get around this tiny insignificant error. And number 1, CGI Imhotep. Many moviegoers criticize how often mainstream movies rely on CGI. However, it shouldn't be an issue when special effects are indistinguishable to the human eye, or just plain old look good. Speaking of which, there's one visual in The Mummy's prologue that the most eagle-eyed of viewers might not have noticed is actually computer generated. When Imhotep is fully bandaged the first time, the character is played by Arnold Vosloo in person. But when the guard throws the scarabs into the sarcophagus, the bandaged figure is 100% CGI. The first question I imagine many of you will ask upon learning this is, why didn't Vosloo just appear in the shot physically? It should be easy since the scarabs are digital, right? Though creating a digital human is complex and time-consuming, it was necessary for the shot Stephen Sommers had in mind. Since the scarabs were digital themselves, it would be easy for them to interact with another CGI effect. All this may sound totally unnecessary, but the finished product really does speak for itself. The digital Imhotep moves so realistically in this sequence that it's hard to believe he's nothing more than a bunch of polygons.